Hi everyone, welcome to episode 3 of Au Pair Freedom, the channel where we answer the question, how does gendered work affect international flows of labor and exchange? In this episode, we will be discussing the au pair exchange in the United States and Australia. So first off, let me start with the United States. The United States have passed domestic workers' bills of rights to protect workers, such as house cleaners, nannies, and in-home health aides who are not covered by many U.S. labor laws and are amongst the lowest paid workers in the country. Massachusetts is the first state with legal confirmation that au pairs are domestic workers. The First Circuit Court of Appeals ruled that au pairs in Massachusetts are covered by state labor laws and included in the state's domestic worker bill of rights. This entitles them to the state minimum wage of $12.75 an hour and time and a half for overtime work. The weekly deduction for room and board is set to $77. The ruling by the First U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals joins other legal action in the past year aimed at protecting the rights of au pairs, including a decision made in June of 2019 for $65.5 million in a settlement in a Denver court of a class action lawsuit brought by former au pairs claiming they are underpaid and overworked. Categorizing the au pair program as cultural exchange allows the Department of State, rather than Department of Labor, to give oversight of the program to recruitment agencies that many times do not report labor exploitation. So to give a bit of context about why this is, I would like to discuss how the U.S. au pair program began. The American Institute of Foreign Study, who now is in charge of au pairs in America, targeted the U.S. Information Agency to create the program. The U.S. Information Agency has the exclusive power of issuing cultural exchange visas, known as the J-1 Exchange Visitor Program. The U.S. Information Agency grants the J-1 visas for programs that incorporate scientific and cultural knowledge. When the U.S. Information Agency refused to sponsor the program because the labor aspect took away from the cultural exchange experience, making it more of a temporary guest work program, the American Institute of Foreign Study went to Congress with the argument that the program filled the role for flexible and affordable childcare in the United States. They argued that young, educated European adults could live with middle-income American families at no cost to the government because the host families pay for the whole program. When the U.S. Information Agency argued that the 45-hour work week went against the requirements of the J-1 visa, Congress stepped in and forced the U.S. Information Agency to accept the 45 hours as part of the J-1 visa for au pairs. Now, it can be argued that au pairs are worse off than other migrant workers because their domestic work goes unprotected. The au pairs carry out their work in the home, which is invisible to the public both physically and conceptually. To make matters worse, the cultural exchange label of au pairing keeps it off the radar of domestic worker rights. So next up, we're going to be discussing Australia. In Australia, there are 3 paths to becoming an au pair. The most common path is an independent one, which is to find a job on the internet through portal sites or SNS, au pair communities, apply for a working holiday visa, and then arrive in Australia. The other 2 paths are to register with au pair placement agencies, either in the sending countries or in Australia, or to have personal connections. While many au pairs had a document that listed their duties and tasks, such documents do not list their stipends, working hours, and days off. In some cases, they signed an agreement but never received a copy, even when they asked for one, or the content of the agreement was later modified by the host family without the au pair's consent. The majority of au pairs, however, had a heavy full-time workload and were often forced to work overtime, except for demi-pairs who work for 20 or less hours a week. Against the stipulations that the Australian government required au pairs to take of children rather than domestic work, 87.8% of au pairs conducted both childcare and domestic work, and a portion of female au pairs were mostly in charge of domestic work. The au pairs who got their job through au pair agencies relied on the staff to solve their problems. However, since the vast majority of them had found their job through the internet and SNS communities, they had no one who could negotiate for them at the time of difficulty. You see, in Australia, there is no systemic institutional help available to au pairs. Most Australian civil society organizations serve only permanent immigrants and are not specifically designed for and do not address the issue of temporary migrants. such as au pairs. Now, Australia's government changed its immigration regulation in 2015, and this enabled au pairs to stay with one employer for more than 6 months. And this is clearly aimed to provide more au pairs for Australian families. The Australian government's overall laissez-faire policy on au pairs can be interpreted as a deliberate state strategy to increase the supply of labor and reduce the state's care subsidy. Au pairs come to Australia, highlighted in the first route, through working holiday visas. Now, this visa was created for Europeans and Americans to have a cultural exchange for up to 1 year in Australia. What the WHV solves is the growing requirement for inexpensive and flexible childcare without the ideology that housework and home-based care are not work. The difference between WHV visa holders and regular guest workers is reinforced in the eligibility requirements of the WHV, which are age, national background, in developed countries of course, and money to finance travel. The WHV regulations creates a contradictory regulatory framework. And this excludes au pairs from employment protection, yet treats au pairs as workers within immigration regulations. The danger now is that au pairs could be governed through immigration regulation, even though their visa shows otherwise. Au pairs are in danger of becoming unauthorized workers and are susceptible to detention and removal from Australia because the ambiguities surrounding whether their tenure with families is classified as work is outside of the sanctioned limits of their visas. Now, host families are immune from lawful prosecution for illegally employing au pairs who are unauthorized migrant workers. And this is because Australia's employer sanction laws include a carve-out for domestic labor. Now, this allows host families to attract low-wage migrant labor while rejecting an overall guest work scheme. In episode 5, we will be discussing different groups of au pairs who are the most susceptible to exploitation. Thank you for listening.